of Canada. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Karen McCrindle, Associate Dean, Teaching and Learning, and the Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning here at UTSC. Welcome, it's wonderful to see everyone out. I'm pleased to be introducing the third speaker of the Fall 2019 Great Exploration Season, which has a disability studies theme. Please be sure to fill out our feedback form letting us know what upcoming topics you'd like to see in future sessions. Anne McGuire is Assistant Professor in the Equity Studies program at the University of Toronto. Drawing on interpretive perspectives in feminist disability studies, queer crip theory, cultural studies, and critical race theory, her areas of teaching and research engage questions of human vitality and the spectral politics of disability and risk. She is author of War on Autism, on the Cultural Logic of Normative Violence with the University of Michigan Press, which was awarded the 2015 Tobin Siebers Prize for Disability Studies. Anne's pedagogical work on access and undergraduate teaching has been recognized with the June Larkin Award and the University of Toronto's Early Career Teaching Award. She is currently collaborating with Kelly Fritsch and Eduardo Trejos on a children's book focused on disability, community, and interdependency. Her talk today, Tracking Autism, Wearable Tech and the Digitization of Disabled Childhoods, will explore recent developments and debates in the world of therapeutic wearable technologies, specifically a range of anxiety tracking wearables that are being marketed to autism stakeholders. Armed with the biodata that wearables track, the parents and caregivers are thought to be better positioned to intervene when the wearer's anxiety level rises. The talk discusses the limits of the use of bioinformatics as a way of knowing and relating to and across disability difference, raising key questions around surveillance, privacy, and consent, issues around government and control of disabled children's affect, and issues around the challenge, a challenge to presumed good of ongoing perpetual therapy for disabled autistic children. Please join me in welcoming Professor McGuire to UTSC today.
Okay, I'm going to move this. I'm wearing a lot of wires today. And now I need to remember which ones I have to turn on, so just a second. Oh, it's on. Can you hear me? No, this is muted. Is that better? Okay. Okay, thank you so much for coming out, and thank you for the welcome. It's so lovely to be here today with a full room on such a rainy day, and it's post-election. I wish I had known that before I had signed up today. I had to go to bed a little bit earlier than I wanted to last night. Today I'm going to offer you a kind of a cultural commentary on some recent developments and debates in the world of digital wearable technology. And I'm going to try and consider how technological advancements are really shaping our understanding of disability, and in particular, autism, which is my kind of area of research interest. I wanted to kind of say a few words of how I've come to this project. And I'm coming to this project not from the perspective of a psychologist or a computer scientist or a tech developer. I'm coming to it from the perspective of an interdisciplinary humanities scholar who's really interested in thinking about how culture and technology impact and really have come to mediate disabled people's access to things like rights, respect, social justice. And so that's kind of the perspective that I'm taking when I'm thinking with and through the emergence of these mobile wearable devices. I'm teaching and doing research in the field of disability studies, as you already know. And because of this, I understand autism in perhaps a way that is not as typical as we might dominantly understand autism in mainstream culture. I understand autism through disability studies and disability rights and activism as a developmental disability, a beautiful and sometimes challenging, non-normative way of being in the world. I also understand autism as a personal and political identity category, something that people identify with and through. Autism is also understood as a connective thread that's holding together a vibrant culture and community of neurodiverse people and their allies. So all of this to say that we can understand autism in complex ways, whereas kind of the dominant ways that we often talk about autism is simply as a disease in need of a cure or through a biomedical understanding of what autism is and can be. So we can think about autism, in other words, as both a material category, a real material category that has particular effects for people who are living with it. But we can also think about autism as a social and political phenomenon that has a lot to teach us about how we live together, how we live collectively, and how we relate to and across our differences. So my research and my perspectives here are really flowing from a disability rights principle that we talk about in terms of nothing about us without us. In other words, this work is born of and really responsive to the insights of a great many autistic self-advocates, autistic people, scholars, activists, who have been for over 2 decades now engaged in the task of building worlds and futures that are more inhabitable, more accessible for more people. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my thoughts today. This is as a work in progress. This is kind of an it's an evolving project, let's say. And because of that, I'm really interested and excited to hear your thoughts, your feedback, your responses. So in this discussion period at the end of the talk. In particular, if you have experiences or reflections with using wearable technology, I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on that as well. Okay, so I'm going to kind of jump into the bulk of my talk here. Back in 2016, Awake Labs, which originated as a startup out of the University of British Columbia, leaped onto the tech scene with a hot new prototype of a mobile digital device called Reveal. And I'll reveal it in a minute. You're looking at a blank screen here. The device, which was initially designed to be used on or with autistic children, promised to measure and track anxiety in real time in order to provide parents, caregivers, and therapists with quantified data off of which they might base their care. Okay, so I have a reveal. I have on the screen an image of the Reveal prototype. Again, this is circa 2016 on the screen. I'm looking at a bright blue silicone wrist or leg band that's equipped with a series of digital sensors on the inside of the band. The top side of the band is engraved with a simple upward arch that almost makes the device look like it's smiling, I think. I'm sure that was intentional. Next up, I have a screen grab, so an image taken from the main page of the lab's website. And it describes, and again, this is from 2016, it describes how the prototype is functioning. It functions in 3 phases, we can see. Measure, notify, react. The band's built-in sensors measured and track physiological indicators of anxiety in their wearer. So it would take continuous readings of a child wearer's sweat output, their heart rate, skin temperature, and then it would push this data through a machine learning algorithm. And I'm a humanities scholar, so don't ask me too many questions about machine learning algorithms, but rudimentary knowledge here, but I have a general sense. When the device registers rising anxiety levels, it sends a notification to the child's caregiver or therapist via an app on their smartphone. Armed with this data, care providers are thought to be better positioned to intervene, to learn something about the autistic child's triggers and to reduce those triggers so as to stave off so-called behavioral meltdown. When the Reveal prototype was first released in 2016, as I said, it was hot tech. The gadget made headlines both here in Canada and internationally. It was received with much enthusiasm and written up by the CBC, the Globe and Mail, the Vancouver Sun, Forbes magazine. It was spotlighted on major technology blogs like World Economic Forum, Digital Trends. Awake Labs CEO Andrea Palmer took the top prize at a number of local and international social innovation competitions, including the Canadian Global Impact Competition in 2015, which recognized Reveal to be the most innovative idea to positively impact 1 million Canadians over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. The prototype, it should be noted, was also really extremely well received among parents and caregivers of autistic kids. And I have a quote up on the screen by the CEO of Awake Labs, Andrea Palmer, who said in an interview in 2015, "Everyone wants Reveal and they want it right now." So I don't want to unduly single out this one prototype as somehow unique or exceptional. It's now been almost 4 years since this device first made headlines, which in the world of digital wearables is like light years ago. And a lot has changed since then, which I'll talk a little bit about, but also a lot hasn't changed. And so this bright blue band never went beyond its prototype phase, but the feverish public and private interest in the autism wearable continues to grow. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, my talk is really coming out of, or is engaged with considering the emerging cultural, technological, and clinical interest in the autism wearable from the vantage point of disability rights and justice. To do this, I treat the autism wearable as a kind of culturally and historically specific artifact that stands to shape and really is already shaping, in particular contexts, disabled people's lives and social relations. If the autism wearable is indeed poised to impact the lives of 1 million Canadians in the coming years, I ask, what is the nature of that impact? And is this imagined future a more just and accessible one for disabled and autistic people? Autism wearables reflect a therapeutically oriented approach to managing autistic life, as we're going to see as I get into them in a few minutes. And yet, for many neurodiverse people and their allies, autism often isn't understood as a disease. It's not a disease in need of targeted therapeutic elimination for many people living with and in and through the category of autism. And so while autistic people might often and to varying degrees require accommodations and support in order to access and navigate a neurotypical world or a non-autistic world, autism is itself understood as having inherent value, as are autistic movements, behaviors, perspectives, and cultures. Because what autism is and what it means is so highly contested in the contemporary landscape, the emergence of the therapeutic autism wearable at this time really, I think, needs some slow and careful and critical attention for what it means and what it's doing. Before I delve into my analysis of kind of the specific allure of the autism wearable, I want to zoom out for a minute and dwell within the context of personal tracking cultures more generally. This idea of tracking bodily responses is nothing new, actually. For centuries, humans have made use of analog devices to measure and monitor shifting states of wellness and gradations of health and illness. I'm thinking here, for example, of the thermometer, which of course measures sliding scales of body temperature, or the weight scale, personal health diaries, even things like measuring one's abdominal girth using a soft tape measure, or marking out a child's height on a wall or a door frame. All of these examples can be loosely classified or grouped together as analog or non-digital practices of personal tracking. Thanks to technological advances in the 90s, we've seen the modernization and the digitization of many of these tracking methods. So here we can include telehealth technologies, in-home computerized devices like portable blood pressure cuffs, blood glucose monitors, and things like smart scales that calculate BMI, for example. And now, what we're seeing with huge advancements in mobile and wireless technology, the ubiquity of the smartphone and other connected devices, and as electronic sensors are becoming smaller, more sensitive, more cheap are produced more cheaply, we're seeing the emergence of an ever-expanding array of devices designed for real-time data collection, providing continuous analyses of our bodies, our minds, our movements, our behaviors, our feelings, even our social interactions. The range of these self-tracking devices is expansive. Immediately, we can think about the popular Fitbit-style activity trackers, or the Apple Watch with its many health applications, health-related applications. These devices are typically worn on the wrist, as you probably already know, and they generate a stream of personal metrics, so recording the number of steps that you walk or stairs that you climb, measuring heart rate, and so on. Wearables, of course, are not only limited to the realm of personal fitness and wellness. There are literally tens of thousands of mobile personal tracking devices on the market today. And when I was doing research for this project, I kind of went down a rabbit hole, like looking at all the different tracking devices that are out there. But you can purchase, for example, one of a range of work and productivity trackers, sleep trackers, sexual performance trackers, fertility trackers. The list goes on, but I found some pretty funny ones, so I'm going to share those. So this is powered by the technology Slow Control. This is Happy Fork. It's a smart fork that counts the numbers of bites that you're taking, and it starts to vibrate if you're eating too quickly, and it won't stop. And it won't stop vibrating until you put it down and readjust your rate of food intake. That's a good one. This is Starling. It's being marketed as an early education system. It's a little clip that it clips onto your infant or toddler's clothes and counts the numbers of developmentally stimulating words that you would speak to your child, and then pings your phone with kind of a breakdown of that result. Yeah, okay. And like Reveal, we're also seeing the emergence of a range of autism-specific wearables, which I'll talk more about in just a minute, that are being used to measure, interpret, and even predict people's affective responses or emotional responses. It's important to note that the emergence of digital health and wellness trackers has largely been celebrated. In general, it's an uncontested good in kind of mainstream culture, and as has the presumed social and individual good of continual optimization of our bodies, our minds, our moods, and so on. There's something, I think, of unique cultural significance when it comes to wearable mobile technologies, how these devices oversee, surveil, and oftentimes record human actions and inactions, how they define good and bad behaviors or responses, how they narrate risk, and finally, how they encourage or perhaps even compel us to understand and use our bodies, always with particular normative and socially desirable ideals in mind. Whereas old school thermometers and weight scales rely on periodic, site-specific measurements and assessments as a way of determining bodily states of health or illness, the digital wearable makes possible mobile monitoring and continuous assessment. Relying, as they do, on sensors and advanced computational algorithms to translate bodily emissions into actionable data, we act on the data that we receive through these devices. These gadgets calculate and predict risk in real time. They offer a kind of digital nudge. They induce the wearer to adjust their conduct, thinking about this fork, adjust their conduct ever in the presumed right and good direction of optimal health and well-being. This is the era of the quantified self, which, as Deborah Lupton has effectively argued, part of the project of managing the contemporary body is that of the containment of the data that one's body is always producing in and through these devices or connected devices. Via cultures of digital tracking, we're now being charged with the task of responding to and managing the reams of information or data that our bodies are emitting. This idea that we are our data, this logic that the self can be better, if not best known by careful attention to and quantification of bodily emissions, is deeply alluring in its sense of transparency, its honesty. Humans make errors. Humans make errors, writes Gary Wolf, who's a managing editor at Wired magazine, and he's a co-founder of the self-tracking website quantifiedself.com. These weaknesses put us at a disadvantage. As humans, he continues, we make decisions with partial information. We're forced to steer by guesswork. We go with our gut. That is, some of us do. Others, he says, use data. If you want to replace the vagaries of intuition with something more reliable, argues Wolf, you first need to gather the data. Once you know the facts, you can live by them. Wolf's comments here confirm and uphold the presiding Western cultural sense of trust in the efficiency, neutrality, and veracity of numbers, the sense that numbers don't lie. Numbering things allows tests, comparisons, experiments, Wolf goes on to argue. Numbers make problems less resonant emotionally and more tractable intellectually. In science, in business, in the more reasonable sectors of government, he says, numbers have won fair and square. Why then, Wolf seems to be asking, would we not turn to numbers to better, more efficiently manage the unpredictable and often outright unruly private sectors of our lives, our homes, and our bodies? As we engage with Wolf's kind of impassioned manifesto of the value of body data and personal tracking, I think we can take a moment's pause here and ask some important questions. While numbers themselves maybe don't lie, and we can debate that, I don't know, they also don't exist in a vacuum. Wolf's appeal to the technical transparency and indeed to the kind of essential boringness of numbers functions to mask another and perhaps less convenient truth. Numerical measures are most certainly produced, collected, interpreted, and used by people. Numbers are, in other words, a key site of human controversy and struggle. And because of this, we would do well, I believe, to locate our contemporary usages of body numbers against our social, historical, political, and economic landscapes, those spaces in which we live and the cultures in which we live. So let's do that. As we look at personal digital tracking cultures from the vantage point, for example, of neoliberal capitalism, the logic is pretty tight. As Lupton has argued, the phenomenon of digital self-tracking epitomizes a neoliberal political orientation that seeks to privatize health with the allure of empowered health consumers who optimistically engage in ongoing risk assessments and preventative interventions that often prioritize neoliberal ideals of the independent, productive, cost-efficient, flexible body over and against other kinds of bodies, and in particular, disabled ones. The phenomenon of digital self-tracking is infused with the highly emotionally affecting fantasy that if we're diligent, if we track well, observe carefully, respond rightly, that we can control our bodies, their reactions, and ultimately health outcomes. Such a fantasy, in turn, creates a self who is ready and willing to bear the considerable weight of the requirement to lead a life of perpetual health and wellness in the face of this impossibility. As Pasanante Elman importantly reminds us, simply noting that wearable metrics increase our awareness of our susceptibility does not engage substantively with the question of access to actual health care. Health is, of course, deeply social, it's political, it's unevenly distributed among people and populations. People regularly fall into ill health not by personal fault or responsibility, and not even by luck of the draw sometimes, but because of unequal access to adequate, or dare I say, excellent health care. I always think it's funny when people say adequate health care. Well, we want excellent health care. Therapeutic treatments. We want clean water, housing, and food security. People fall into ill health due to environmental racism or the physical and psychological harms of living under systemic oppression. As most self-tracking devices target individual bodies for optimization and improvement, these systemic issues of risk receding, into the background. We don't pay as much attention because we're focusing on the individual body. and our capacity to kind of control outcomes that way. On that note, I thought I'd take a moment to share a noteworthy exception to this, and one that's been in the news a lot this week. So you can look it up. There's a Toronto Star article from a couple of days ago, from Saturday, I think. So here we have a recent app that's launched by some of my colleagues here at the University of Toronto in the Technoscience Lab. Instead of measuring and tracking individual states of health and ill health, this app promotes a commitment to the health of the collective by allowing users to track and report pollution from oil and chemical industries near the Amjunun First Nation in southwestern Ontario. Users of the app can fill out pollution reports in real time and send the information by email to the Provincial Environment Ministry. And so this is a kind of an example of an app or a device that is oriented to kind of thinking about tracking collective health and collective risk, as opposed to locating that health and risk strictly in the individual body of the person. Okay, so it's against this kind of hotly debated cultural landscape of digital self-tracking that the therapeutic autism wearable appears. And yet it cannot escape our attention. Autism wearables are often not interested in self-tracking, and neither are they interested in more kind of collective practices of tracking, as in the environmental pollution app. Most autism wearables that I've encountered are targeting parents, caregivers, and therapists for use on the autistic child or the autistic adult who's so often figured as a child. This particular subset of trackers seems to be engaged, in other words, with tracking the disabled other. Taking stock of the current day scene of autism wearable technology, we're seeing the emergence of quite a number of clinical trials, like this study by Goodwin et al. It was published earlier this year in the Journal of Autism Research. This trial uses a smart device, Empatica, it's on the screen, and a proprietary algorithm to predict and head off aggressive behavior in children as young as 4 living in psychiatric institutional care. Here we have another project by Awake Labs of Reveal fame, currently testing a smartwatch app to, quote, allow facility-based caregivers to track the emotional states of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We're also seeing the development and marketing of smart garments, like this anxiety sensor-equipped t-shirt, currently in the works by the US-based startup Gaia. So this t-shirt kind of has sensors embedded in the fabric and can measure anxiety that way. And one last example, this is from just a few months ago. The Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics published an article touting the positive impacts of autism glass based on a recent Stanford clinical trial. Using augmented reality, these glasses provide autistic youth with visual and auditory clues in real time to help these children or these youth interpret the faces of the people that they encounter. And so on the screen, we're now looking kind of through the glasses. We're looking at our interlocutor, and a simple word pops up. Sometimes it's an emoji, and it says happy. This is meant to cue the autistic child wearer into what the device has determined is going on in the interlocutor's brain, and to teach the child about the importance of looking at other people's faces, which is a neurotypical behavioral norm that is understood to be essential for social interaction. And again, many autistic activists and advocates, self-advocates have kind of contested, well, do we really need to be looking at each other's faces if it's uncomfortable for us? Who benefits from that kind of requirement for social interaction, and can we ask neurotypical people also to adapt to autistic ways of being and autistic comfort levels? So as these devices mark a shift from tracking the self to tracking the disabled other, they're opening up a host of new issues and raising some, I think, significant ethical tensions regarding disability and power. Questions about compulsory normativity, autonomy, consent, exploitation, surveillance culture, and underneath all of this, questions about accessible futures. I'm going to shift now, and for the remainder of my time today, to a discussion of what I understand to be the limits of using data as a prime way of knowing to and relating across difference. And I'm going to follow this with an exploration of some of these central ethical tensions that are specifically being raised by others tracking autism devices. And I want to be clear here, my stance is really not an anti-technology one. I sometimes worry that people will kind of think that of me. And I want to kind of take a moment to really think about the impact of these devices as a means of designing new kinds of technologies or new kinds of ways of relating that might be more accessible down the line. And so instead I'm asking kind of how are these technologies making possible some comportments, some behaviors, and legitimizing particular kinds of social relations while drastically limiting other comportments or different and particularly non-normative or autistic modes of relating. And to what effect? So what's at stake here? So in her 2013 Slate article, it's called "I Measure Every Single Thing My Child Does," Amy Webb describes her obsession with tracking her infant daughter's personal data. She literally records everything that her child does on a spreadsheet. This is kind of pre-digital wearable device for this particular purpose anyway. From the number of times her kid poops to the number of words she learns, everything is kind of recorded. In her narrative, Webb describes the data she collects as itself a kind of trusted partner or an interlocutor, one that effectively speaks to her on behalf of her pre-verbal child. And I have a quote on the screen from the article. Webb writes, "It occurred to us that while our baby daughter couldn't communicate directly beyond crying, we could have a deeply intimate, beneficial conversation with her through data. We realized we could quantify and study her in an attempt to optimize all of her development." So full disclosure, I'm a parent of two often confounding young humans. And truth be told, like what parent wouldn't want to know a little bit more about what's going on, getting a little bit more insight into what their child is thinking or feeling. And if a child is pre-verbal or non-speaking, if, in other words, a child communicates in a way that might not be readily accessible to the parent, the need for greater insight or more transparency might seem particularly acute. Vis-a-vis the kind of uncomfortable uncertainty and partiality that invariably comes along with raising a child in general, and perhaps raising a disabled child in particular, the accumulation of quantitative data offers us some assurances. And these assurances have really been central to the early buzz around the autism wearable. Calibrated as they are for precision, anxiety and aggression measuring devices like Empatica or like Reveal, or even like the Smart T-shirt by Gaia, these devices seek to eliminate interpersonal uncertainty by offering parents and caregivers and therapists and clinicians a quantified measure of the child's behaviors and emotions. For parents of autistic children, as well as for therapists and other service providers, the digital tracker represents a real promise of communicational transparency, some empirically measurable, quantifiable truths vis-a-vis the so-called puzzling uncertainty of non-autistic autistic relations. In a 2016 promotional video for the early Reveal prototype, behavior analyst Nathan Searle describes his interactions with the device in this way. Armed with data, he says, "It's no longer me against you, trying to get you to do this thing because your behavior is inappropriate. It's me working with you because I can see when you're anxious, I can see when you're scared, I can see when your body is overreacting, and I can provide support." And we can hear kind of the allure of this device in Searle's words, as well as in Webb's, I think. While Webb earlier describes her interactions with her daughter's data as a kind of conversation, Searle here describes his data use as a kind of an enhanced way of seeing. He can see things that otherwise he wouldn't be able to see. While these two accounts differ slightly in terms of how they conceptualize the back and forth of human device, human interaction, for both Webb and Searle, interfacing with the children's biodata becomes not only a way of relating to and across the essential difference between them and the child that they're interacting with, but the best, or at least the most reliable or precise way of relating. So while in other words, while kind of other forms of communication breed uncertainty and the possibility of error, the data, it seems, tells it like it is. So these ideals of interactional or social precision and reliability take on new significance when we consider the kind of communication and interaction that are being facilitated by data tracking. Both Webb and Searle describe a dialogue between adult caregiver and biodata, and the biodata of the child in instrumental terms. Unlike some other forms of caregiver-child relations that we can imagine, where interactions and exchanges might themselves hold some sort of intrinsic value or some sort of pleasure or non-quantifiable affects. In the words of Matthew Goodwin, who's the lead researcher on the Empatica trials, wearable computing functions to instrument people. It functions to transform people into instruments with a particular outcome in mind. The data-driven relation is principally prized, in other words, for its use value, for how it can be used to shape particular kinds of targeted outcomes or desirable futures. It was, for example, only in conversation with her daughter's data that Webb first realized that she could quantify and study her, and in so doing, to optimize all of her development. There was a particular outcome or desirable future in mind in and through that data collection. Searle, the behavioral therapist, describes the excitement over his new way of seeing his clients in terms of a perceived greater power to adjust or redirect the child's non-normative, or what he calls inappropriate, comportment to bring, in other words, his client's autistic behaviors more in line with the presumed desirability of normative or neurotypical ones. The purported kind of neutrality of digitized relations can tempt us to look away from the political dimensions of disability relations and care, to look away from, for example, the fact that we, autistic and non-autistic people, don't always agree on which behaviors, responses, or modes of interaction or ways of relating are optimal. What is more, how and in what ways is a discourse of transparency glossing over the relationship between autism wearables and, as I was mentioning earlier, cultures of neoliberalism. The autism wearable is, after all, engaged in the production of a range of good neoliberal subjects, precision-focused caregivers who must privately purchase tech to enhance their ability to see, hear, respond to, and ultimately optimize their children's affects and behaviors, a practice that in turn promises still more enhanced child subjects, neurodiverse kids who are less disruptive to the presumed good of neurotypical norms and relations. So, tracking autism, what's at stake? Giving you some hints, but let's explore this question a little bit further. So in recent years, there has been an explosion of social scientific research voicing concern about the role played by big data in relation to the personal digital self-tracking phenomenon. Advancements in computing have meant that extremely large amounts of data can now be collected and stored in perpetuity at low cost. This data can be structured or not. It can come from any electronic device or piece of machinery that allows for user interaction. Individual user information is uploaded to the cloud and other centralized data management platforms where it's vulnerable to being, and sometimes it is explicitly being mined by second or third parties, say businesses or corporations, researchers, just to kind of name a few examples. A product of the big data revolution, autism wearables, as we've seen, collect biological outputs on a continuous basis. So a massive stream of intimate personal information is collected from the body of the child wearer and then fed through an algorithm that specifies the probability of that child reaching a presumed undesirable affective state. And just as an example, a parent might be pinged by something like this on their smartphone. It says, Jason's anxiety is 50% over baseline. This level of anxiety has caused 5 meltdowns this past week. Please check on him. So this collection and sharing of personal or even intimate bodily information, perhaps especially when we're talking about children and other vulnerable populations, raises worrying questions about issues around privacy and consent. Well, people engage in personal self-tracking, so your Apple Watch wearers or your Fitbit wearers, for example, do provide consent, and we can debate this question, but at least nominally are providing consent for the sharing of their own personal biological or psychological data. The autism wearable is principally being marketed to someone else, marketed to parents, caregivers, therapists, for use on the subject, the autistic child, many of whom don't communicate using spoken language. We have to ask, is the autistic child or the autistic adult that, again, is so routinely figured as child not entitled to the privacy of their physiological responses? Autism wearable tracking, the autism wearable tracks physiological indicators of, say, anxiety or aggression, and this act of tracking has to assume a certain level of entitlement on the part of parents, caregivers, and therapists. It assumes that the adult caregiver, in other words, has the implicit right to both access and scrutinize the child's every waking internal physiological response. Every rise and fall of skin temperature is recorded. Every time one breaks a sweat, it's noted for posterity. Each time one's pulse quickens, it's watched out for and seen. Relatedly, the autism wearable begs the question, and I think this is an interesting one too, if I do say so myself, are disabled autistic children no longer permitted to express a full range of feelings, emotions, and affect? And how does this technology mediate the child, or again, the adult, figured as child's capacity to express a full range of feelings, and do those feelings serve a purpose, and other than simply something that needs to be marked and eliminated, or marked for elimination? I would say yes. For non-speaking autistic people in particular, autistic movements and behaviors are not mere symptoms of disorder and overreaction, to use Cyril's words, but primary forms of communication. Non-affirmative communications like no or stop might look and do look a lot like behavioral noncompliance, aggression, meltdown. Might these physiological trackers run the risk of treating agentive autistic communication as symptoms of disorder in need of prevention and elimination? What is more, some designers seem to be envisioning a scenario where the wearer might not even be aware that they're being monitored. Palmer, in an interview in 2015 by the CBC, or on the CBC, said that the revealed prototype was being designed to be, quote, completely imperceptible. Quote, many children with autism have this heightened sensitivity to change in their routine and their environment, she goes on to say, so we want them to be able to wear the device without even knowing that it's there, end quote. Another complicating question with respect to consent. The biological information garnered from the therapeutic autism wearable are being used to create whole databases from which autism researchers can draw. And the use of big data for research purposes is a particularly murky kind of terrain. Here we might draw on Lupton's analysis of self-tracking as a kind of free digital labor, she says, which results in exploitation, researchers profiting financially and otherwise off of the personal data given potentially with neither consent nor compensation. This issue was made really clear in a recent investigation published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, where it was uncovered that no fewer than 29 of the 36 top-ranked apps that are being used for managing depression or quitting smoking shared data with Google and Facebook. This, even though only 12 of these apps, 12 of the 29 apps, indicated the possibility of data sharing in their terms and agreements. So even kind of in personal self-tracking, this issue of consent is very relevant, I think, and perhaps more so when it comes to tracking others. According to the American Medical Association, quote, wearable devices, mostly in the forms of watches, bracelets, vests, or glasses, are not regulated if they're intended for for general wellness uses, which include maintaining or encouraging a general state of health or activity, or reducing the risk or impact of chronic disease. And while regulation of mHealth apps like the ones being discussed today is ever evolving, the technologies and even the rules of the game are evolving much, much quicker. And so the bureaucracy of the regulatory bodies is having a real challenge keeping up. Okay, I'm just trying to think about what I'm going to do next. Okay, one final point that I wanted to touch on today, and I'm going to do so kind of too briefly, brings us back to the question of personalized therapeutics and quantified healthcare more generally. Continuous mobile monitoring devices are functioning to reinscribe new meanings to old conditions. More and more diseases, illnesses, and disabilities, including autism, that were once understood to be acute and categorically defined, static pathologies that required a cure, are now being framed more and more as chronic, enduring conditions that with ongoing oversight and perpetual, sometimes preemptive or preventative treatment can be managed and ultimately lived with. At the same time as wearable tech devices are revolutionizing the nature of many disability health conditions, they're also shaping the terms of their response. As autism is increasingly depicted in both scientific literature and pop culture as a kind of chronic spectral problem, one that is composed of an infinite and unstable range of gradations of symptom severity, anchored by the extremes of health on the one hand and pathology on the other, autism wearables are designed to monitor continuously for risk and correspondingly provide the grounds for a range of autism management solutions. And here's a quote from Fidgel, who's the head of product development at Awake Labs, where he characterizes the relationship between the spectral problem of autism, or this kind of common pop cultural phrase of once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, kind of inscribing this like hyper-individuality of autistic people, which is, you know, in one sense really productive, but in another hand, kind of individualizes the condition even further. And so he says that the flexible tech solution of the wearable kind of gives us the sense that every individual is different and every individual deserves to have a tool that's reflective of their own uniqueness. The autism wearables discussed today can be read as assisting a move away from a one-size-fits-all vision of healthcare, pushing us toward a kind of a deregulated and very uncertain future of highly profitable, individually tailored personal health solutions, from we to me healthcare, to borrow from Donna Dixon. While there's plenty of optimism in medical and scientific communities surrounding the future of personalized healthcare and therapeutics, and I don't want to dismiss this optimism outright, but rather to kind of complicate it somewhat. It's an optimism that still requires deep engagements with questions around ethics, power, access, and justice. My small contribution to this end is a call for more critical engagement with the ways in which these technologies function in the regulation and control of people and bodies. And so I conclude with one final observation to this end. The instrumental use of data as a means of optimizing, and we can also think about normalizing, autistic children's comportment is not in and of itself anything new. Based on a series of participant interviews with behavioral therapists here in Ontario, Julia Grusin-Wood offers a compelling discussion of the ways in which data collection has become a routine part of the therapy process. Indeed, Grusin-Wood goes as far as to suggest that the labor of administering behavioral therapies in Ontario is becoming so technical, so driven by tracking, measurement, standardization, replicability, and compliance, that the therapists themselves are learning, in her words, to relate to themselves as malleable instruments, tasked with, quote, engineering targeted therapeutic outcomes. So what is new here is via the mobile wearable, long-standing and deeply contested medicalized therapeutic approaches to autism are infiltrating and really defining those spaces outside of the clinic. So because the technology allows us to move from clinic to home, to playground, to school, it raises, again, new questions. Where neurotypical people, be they parents or friends, siblings or teachers, are learning to understand themselves as, well, para-practitioners, always charged with the task of noticing and redirecting autistic affects, behaviors, and relations in the presumed good and right direction of the contested center of neurotypicality. Autism wearables like the ones that I've touched on today promise to connect parents and caregivers with virtual communities of doctors and researchers and other experts so as to empower individuals and families for better therapeutic care at home. And indeed, there's a lot of excitement already around autism research communities around the prospect of supplementing professionally delivered clinical therapies with at-home therapies that are delivered by parents as parapractitioners. This idea is really summed up in this headline from October 2016 in The Economist, which reads, "Dealing with Autism, First Treat the Parents." And below in the subheading, "Turning Mothers and Fathers into Therapists Helps Autistic Children." That Stanford study with the Google Glass to help children identify people's faces and emotions through augmented reality was explicitly developed, in the words of the head researcher Dennis Wall, for its potential to facilitate the delivery of behavioral therapy, quote, in the home setting by parents without the actual input or intervention of a trained clinician, end quote. And yet it becomes equally important against all of this to ask, again, what vision of the future is conjured by the therapeutic autism wearable? Against a contemporary Canadian backdrop where more and more children are receiving an autism label, 1 in 66, according to the latest statistic, where the provincial government's sanctioned best practice can mean up to 40 hours a week of intensive and very costly one-on-one behavioral therapy. And as the wait times to publicly access these therapies can be 2 years long, often more, the idea that there might be a more personal or parental responsibility and accountability in all of this, at least from an economic standpoint, is highly attractive. This idea of the clinic at home is made all the more attractive, I think, in light of recent provincial government cutbacks to autism services in Ontario. And I have on the screen an image, a photograph taken from March 2019, which shows parents and caregivers at a rally at Queen's Park protesting the provincial cuts to autism services in the province, in Ontario. Emerging as it is out of a booming consumer health market, the autism wearable bears the promise of cheaper, more efficient, maybe even outright profitable means of managing the so-called contemporary autism crisis. In fact, just this past month, there's Andrew Scheer. Just this past month, Andrew Scheer promised that if elected, his party would invest $50 million in developing a national autism strategy that would, in his words, quote, develop strategies for more enhanced forms of care. At a press conference, he indicated that in developing this strategy, he said he would bring together a range of experts and what he called stakeholders, and then he named them, and they included provincial health officials and parents. Glaringly missing from this list of autism stakeholders was, of course, autistic people themselves. And with all of the economic and intellectual investments in the future of therapeutic autism wearables, I have not, as of yet, encountered a single study asking the question, is this future imagined by the therapeutic autism wearable a more accessible one for disabled and autistic people? So I think that's a good place to start. Just to conclude, is that they're born out of and responsive to a culture of neoliberal biocapitalism, autism wearables are profoundly bound to a therapeutically oriented approach to life. I worry that the technology is functioning to produce the autistic subject as one that is always in need of oversight and adjustment, one that is required moreover to seek out or be subjected to personal enhancements or individual enhancements as a prerequisite for inclusion into the kind of vital fold of good life. This imagined future of incremental surveillance and perpetual therapy may work dangerously to diminish the space wherein autistic people, and including and especially those who are understood to be encoded as severe, can access kind of the complexities and variegations of disabled and autistic life and culture and other ideological and material conditions of survival. And just by way of an epigraph, epilogue, not epigraph. By way of an epilogue, I wanted to, this is kind of, I put this on the slide just an hour before the talk. But when I woke up this morning, I was really pleased to read the news that my disability studies colleague and prominent autistic activist and lawyer Lydia Brown was appointed as a co-lead on Georgetown's new institute project on algorithmic fairness and disability rights. And so this is a kind of an example or a significant move, and the first kind of similar one that I've seen, or one that I've seen in this vein, that's really kind of, I hope, beginning to address some of the issues and concerns raised in today's lecture. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens next on this project. And thank you for listening for the past hour.